Hello, this is the Nolan Bylenga Podcast. I'm Nolan Bylenga, the host, and today we're joined by Jim Doherty. Jim is a former Morrow County Commissioner, a small business owner, and is currently running in the Republican primary for State Senate in Oregon's 29th District. Jim, I appreciate you coming on the show. I invited you on so that we could learn a little bit about your campaign, some of the issues being faced in Eastern Oregon. If you'd like to dive into some of that stuff, just your background.
Yeah, no, first of all, Nolan, I appreciate you reaching out and giving me this opportunity, right, to come and speak and visit with you. And I know you've been an Eastern Oregon boy out here, and now you're running, remind me, for House District 3 for Congress. Is that correct?
Yep, it's Oregon's 3rd congressional district.
Or Oregon 3rd congressional district. Yeah, well, that's fantastic, and I see you're kind of rather on the opposite side of the aisle than myself. But there's people are people, right? And then by the end of the podcast, I think you'll maybe want to reconsider and join a compassionate conservative. So no, I just Nolan, but I do really appreciate you bringing me on. Yeah, it's rather unique out in Eastern Oregon, right? I was born and raised here, about as far out in the sticks as you could get, about midway between Heppner and Ukiah and Pilot Rock, if I might, right up in the timberline. I took some folks up there the other day, and they said, "Oh my gosh!" I said, "This is the house I was born and raised in." And it's it's an hour and a half from quote unquote civilization, but it was a fantastic start. My folks had a large sheep and cattle operation, and I have 9 brothers and sisters, right? So, time you were knee high, you were holding one end of an irrigation pipe, or you went to work, and you learned what those things were about, and you learned how to get along with your family and make things work, and so, it was good. And so Eastern Oregon is so deep into my bones. And I moved on and my wife and I built a cattle operation, my wife and I and son, to be fair, from the ground up. We now run about 700 cows and have about 1,000 irrigated acres. My son's a fishing guide, but this time of year he's, helping dad, out feeding cows and calving the cows and doing these kind of things. But, it's tough in the margins are pretty thin in the ag industry, right? And certainly in the livestock industry. So, he's gone out and made a living for himself and set up things. And he's, like say, an outfitting guide. And, I'm not going to give him the plug on here. Doherty Outfitters, I'm not going to go out and say that. But if somebody was to look it up, he'll show them a fantastic time. So I, grew up out in the sticks, and then, spent my life moving a little closer to civilization all the while, and wanting to reach out and just help people, right? And to me, it's about that. I get up every day, and you look at small businesses or folks that are struggling with the nitrate challenges or infrastructure, and you certainly don't go out there and ask what their ideology is, right? Which side of the aisle they sit on before you say these are things we got to attack. I think. I think you can hold true to your principles, right, and your values, and protect the liberties that you've understood and grown up with. At the same time, which in my heart runs fairly conservative, right? Certainly fiscally. At the same time, I think people are people, right? And one of the biggest things I embarked on, the last couple of years, like I said, I was a 2-term county commissioner and past president of the Association of Oregon Counties, all 36 of them, right? And by and large, the 36 counties have the same issues, whether they're social issues or infrastructure issues or small business issues, inflation issues, but it affects probably each of the counties in a little differing order, right? You get into maybe the metro region where there's a little more concentration of folks, and some of the social issues or the challenges related to a larger population come to the fore. You get out here where it's a little more spread out, and by a little more spread out, I mean that when I'm elected, I will represent all or part of 11 counties. And I don't think folks, appreciate that or realize that. It'll be Wallowa County and Union County, Umatilla County, Morrow County, Gillum County, Wheeler County, Sherman County, most of Wasco County, excluding the Dalles, the landmass certainly of Jefferson County, and then a little bit of Marion and Clackamas County. I thought it was interesting here a couple months ago, the Marion County GOP met right down in Salem to talk about their GOP issues. And I drove down and joined them that night in Salem. And they, were happy to have me there. And the president or the chair of the GOP got up and made an introduction. And he says, I think this is fantastic that we got a senator that's running way out in Eastern Oregon that comes all the way down to Salem to meet with us. And I said, well, first and foremost, I think, we got to reach across, district lines and all these things. And, because we're not isolated out here. We're certainly not isolated from them. But I relayed to them, I said, the reason I'm here is you are frankly part of my district, which they, found a little bit hard to believe. But that's with the redistricting. So, it takes conversely, one of the challenges, I think, a little bit, Nolan, is that in the Portland metro area, if I might, there's 19 legislators. And so when you get down to Salem and we've got certainly, fentanyl challenges and homeless challenges and, social challenges that reside out here in the district and in Eastern Oregon, but certainly at a different level. So when there's one bucket of funds and, we need some infrastructure, middle housing, or, some of these things are our priority, I think it's important to get those legislators down there to understand, that those funds, in equal measure need to come out here and shore up our lives as much as they need to. But it's tough, with one senator kind of stepping forward and having to, dice it out as I were with 19. So I'm sorry, Nolan, you asked me to introduce myself and I get so passionate about it. Right. And so anyway, that's kind of who and what I'm about.
No, I think it gave people, any viewers and listeners, a pretty good idea of where your mind's at when it comes to a lot of things. And I like that, people is people. That's something that I'm big on. Building bridges. Back when I was running a campaign in 2020, I was greeted, with the county commissioners. They allowed me to come into their offices, and Umatilla County commissioners, and meet with them, even though a lot of them were conservative. I was Democrat at the time. Still am a Democrat, but it's always good to build bridges and have dialogue, like regardless, because I think the issues, you're spot on. Like we got to handle the issues, right? Going off of that, what would you say are the biggest issues specifically in Eastern Oregon?
Yeah, well, I think to kind of piggyback on what you were saying there a little bit. We've seen divisiveness and we've seen how it doesn't move things forward, right? When I became the president of the Association of Oregon Counties, the Association of Oregon Counties was starting to look like Salem in the national politics, right? The R's and the D's and the folks were segregating themselves and kind of putting their firewalls up and discontinuing dialogue. So my presidential initiative was cross-cultural discussions, right? And so we set it up and we said, look, you've got to pick an Eastern, if you're in the metro region, you got to pick a sister county in Eastern Oregon, and you got to go out there and spend some time there and try and understand their challenges, right? Walk in their shoes. Conversely, the Eastern Oregon County commissioners had to pick somebody in the valley and go down there and spend some time with. And I'm trying to remember the Union County Commissioner, and actually Sushila Jayapal was Multnomah County Commissioner at the time, and she wound up going out to Union County, and the Union County might have been Matt Scarfo. I'm not certain, but he went to Portland, to Metro, and later that fall, you could see as the summer progressed, the barriers started breaking down, and we all started talking to one another again in these meetings, right? And I remember that fall when everybody was kind of talking about how the home and away went, right? And Sushila Jayapal, who was a commissioner at the time, she said, "Oh my God," she says, "you can't imagine how petrified I was going clear out into, the sticks, right? Clear out into the end of creation." And she got up and talked about it. When she was done, the commissioner from Union County said, "If you thought you were scared, imagine I had to go to downtown Portland." So, but they spent time, talking to one another and breaking down those barriers. And it really, really helped. And it's still resonating with the Association of Oregon Counties. They're still able to get along when a lot of the state and national politics aren't. But so I think, Nolan, probably one of the premier challenges out here is, and you hear it, right? The folks that are saying, let's move to Idaho. Let's disconnect ourselves from the Oregon that we knew and loved, because we don't feel like, we don't feel like we're being heard. We feel like we're disenfranchised out here, and we no longer have a voice in Salem. So, one of the first things I'm going to do, and I've got some, crafting the legislation as we speak, and begging and borrowing some of what Governor Kulongoski did back in 2004, is to reinstate the Office of Rural Policy, right? And that'll be made up of representatives from Eastern Oregon, from the businesses and just run-of-the-mill folks and the minorities and these kind of things, to make sure everybody kind of is covered. And then it'll be made up of an equal number of senators and representatives on the Democrat side and the Republican side, and they will be tasked with just looking at and tackling, the rural issues. And in the past, it worked well. It kind of came in and went out with Kulongoski. It had about a 10-year lifespan and never was fully funded, but certainly there was some great things come out of it. And the thing that it allows is it allows the folks out here to really feel like they're being heard. And then it gets both sides of the aisle in the room with them and out here looking at the issues. And you can go down and battle for those dollars a little better, right? Or battle for the services that we need out here. And it once again allows those folks a voice. So I'm really wanting to make that pitch and push. Another thing that's a little, I'm kind of working on 3 pieces of legislation so I can hit the ground running, right? Because we know that, with 10 of the senators that had heretofore been there and are going to be unable to because they, walked out of the building, if I might. And so one of the challenges is, of course, there's going to be a vacuum, right, of institutional knowledge. So I think rather than go in there and have some, ideological ideas of, hey, this is where I need to stand because this is where the right stands or the left stands and these kind of things, I want to be proactive. So, working on a couple more pieces of legislation. One of them is veteran and workforce housing, right, to allow small businesses to some tax relief, right, or access to more capital, or to roll back some of or streamline some of the regulatory compliance, so that these things are easier to do, and set up some low interest or low cost veteran housing. So that's another piece of legislation I'm working on. It's super important out here. I'll speak on the middle housing here in a minute. But the third piece, and it's a little bit of an afar, right? It is that I think we need to hold near and dear the farm ground. I seen an article the other day that said from 2017 to 2024, Oregon had lost 4% of its resource lands, and that is extremely alarming. And, this isn't 4% over my lifetime, or certainly your young lifetime. This is 4% over a half a dozen years. And that is super alarming. The other challenge, so I think we need to work to preserve that. The other challenge is there's a lot of foreign interests that are coming in and certainly buying up our resource lands. They currently own hundreds of thousands of acres of forest land and farmland in Oregon. And I think it's super important that we keep that in local hands, right? And the folks that live it and love it the most. So I'm, looking at crafting a, land grab measure, but Back to the veteran and low interest housing, one of the challenges out here, Nolan, certainly is there's no middle housing, right? And housing costs have gone through the roof. Part of it is a byproduct of some of the data centers that are coming in, and it's pushing rent and home costs up. But you can either get into a trailer house out here circa 1950 or 60, or you can buy a $500,000 to $750,000 home, but you can't find much in between. And it's a huge challenge. And, kids out here, your age, if I might, that are looking for that starter home, or what in the past was the best bank account you could find maybe in your life. And they can't swing a $19,000 to $2,000 rent, and they sure as the devil can't catch up with $2,500 to $2,700 mortgage. So we've got to craft a way to make that happen. So one of the things I'm looking at certainly is to maybe give some tax incentive to the spec housing, to the builders to have an ability to go out there and build that $200,000, $300,000 home that is associated with a $15,000 to $2,000 mortgage, and give them the ability or do some built infrastructure, right? We can use housing as economic development, and make some lots shovel ready, right, with the streets and the sidewalks and the electricity and the connections already set up. It will because it's pretty onerous right now to buy a $50,000 lot and have to put $150,000 into the infrastructure before you start building. And so it cuts their margins down such that they have to build a $500,000 home to make it work for them. But it's certainly not working for people. Maria Montes de Oca is a great friend of mine. She's got a degree in chemical engineering from Oregon State University. Works at a chemical lab in Hermiston, if I might. And this is a gal with a fantastic education, and she's living with multi-generations in a single wide home. I'm certainly certain they love one another, and they work it out. But I visited with her one day, and she says, "Look, I'm desperate to get out of here. Not desperate to leave the folks she's with, but just to, embark on her own journey and maybe have her own home." And she said, "Try as I might, I cannot find one, that fits." And I'm certain she makes a, pretty reasonable wage. So it's tough. So, housing out here certainly is a huge thing. Infrastructure out here, and the bridges, across Eastern Oregon are, they needed replaced 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when certainly you could have done it at half the cost. No, more than half the cost, right? What it's going to cost now. So every time you try and address it, the cost goes up so much that, the folks in Salem want to look away. But if we don't address them, we're never going to get ahead of them. You can't take a full loaded semi with, ag products, whether it's hay or chickens or cows, from Pendleton to John Day. You have to take the smaller sized, 45-foot semi, because, the corners and the bridges and these things are not conducive to it. So with the margins so thin, if you can run a 63-foot, semi up and down the interstate, or in the valley, and conversely, a farmer or rancher out here has to, have the same costs and the same fuel and these things associated, and can only move half the load in one load. These kind of things are, they add up quickly. So there's a lot of challenges out here that, are kind of relative to us, right? That we need to have folks in Salem better understand.
Oh yeah. One thing that, I like you said is because you're talking about issues that I hear here in Multnomah County too, in Portland area, is housing and infrastructure and things like that. And I think people will ask the question, well, why did that side not vote to support, a housing bill or whatnot? But I think it's good to emphasize that there are issues that everybody's talking about, and people are just going about different ways of how they think it should be done. So bringing in dialogue for that between different sides is going to be important, and if people can realize, that we're all talking about the same issues. So I like you bringing up those issues, because I think they're yeah, exactly. I do want to touch on some more, I guess, divisive stuff, right? As you're
Sure.
looking at the walkouts that ended up in the Republicans being barred from running for office again. That includes Senator Hansel. I know that he wasn't going to run initially, I believe, but there's other folks in there where it changes just the dynamic of how you move forward with trying to represent the area. What are your thoughts on that, and whether that might be a tactic you think that comes up again, or whether you're going to try to mitigate, a response like that? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, a couple things, Nolan. First and foremost, I think it's important to suggest that, look, if the situation was so onerous, I'm not afraid to walk out. Certainly there's some things in our past history, whether we're looking at interning people or doing some of the heinous things that other countries have done with folks. But for me walking out, these might happen. But those are pretty far-fetched and pretty hard to imagine that they would happen, right? I think for myself, I think the better way to approach these things is to be the statesman, right? And stand in there and continue to deliver the message that the constituents sent you there to deliver. Right. You get out up on the stump and you take a hard stand and you try and change hearts and minds. I wasn't there certainly with the discussions when the senators walked out. They took a principled stand. One thing that I wonder about a little bit is you could see that legislation coming down the pike, right? It had gone through some other states and made its way west. And I think you need to be proactive, and you need to go out there. And like I say, I'm going in with some 3 or 4, probably 5 pieces of legislation, and good legislation. And I think you need to get out front of these things, right? And I think too much of the time the Republicans have played the defense, right? Have kind of waited and said, well, look, you guys have 2/3 majority. You're going to kind of bring the legislation, and we're going to tell you what's bad, and we're going to push back on it. I think you need to be super proactive and get out front and understand what's coming down the pike, and be the statesman, be ever the statesman. With Senator Bonham going out and Senator Hansel going out and Senator Knopp going out and Senator Finley going out, these guys did fantastic work, right? They did yeoman's work. And when they were in there doing the work, they were getting some great legislation, passed, or certainly efforting to, or forestall, things that maybe weren't healthy for us. But at this point, they're not going to be in there. So I ultimately think the answer is you got to have the conversations, even if they're tough conversations, right? Senator Steiner Hayward is, if I might, a Portland Democrat, a progressive a Democrat, that a doctor, right? And I think she, speaks from her heart and brings things from the right place when she brings them. There's some ideology that I don't, that doesn't line up certainly with myself or for people from Eastern Oregon. But years ago, I think 6-7 years ago, right? I'd have to remember, but 2016, 17, she had a piece of legislation, and I forget ultimately what the bill number was, but for a lack of a better term, it was tobacco 21 legislation, right? Saying you got to be 21 before you can, buy tobacco products. And she was clear out here in Heppner, Oregon, of all places, looking at our mental health facilities and lamenting that day that she had this great piece of legislation that would save lives and save millions of dollars, ultimately in constituent money. And I said, what is it? And she told me, and I said, what's the challenge? And she says, well, I need 1 or 2 Republicans, and it's breaking down on ideology. And so I said, well, tell me more about it. She talked to me about addiction receptors from the time you're 18 to when you're 21, and how they go down 85%. My mother had started smoking when she was 13, when she was in her teens, right? Back in the day when it was not only sexy, but it was quote unquote healthy, right? Or they were certainly saying that. And in her 70s, died of lung cancer. And so I took it to heart, and I says, if this legislation had been in place when she was a kid, perhaps she'd still be with us, right? And so I, read and tried to understand it more. And I went down to Salem and I walked into every representative and every senator I could get to. And I said, guys, this is good legislation. And they said, we understand, but we're going to use it as a chit because we want to get some legislation from the other side. And we don't disagree that this is maybe good legislation. And I said, you're gambling on people's lives. When valuable legislation comes forward, whether it comes forward from an independent, a Democrat, whoever in the hell it is, if it's good legislation, you reach across the aisle, you bridge that divide, and you link arms and you move forward. In the end, I had a heart-to-heart with Senator Hansel, and who himself was a cancer survivor, right? And he said, that he was going to go sit down with Senator Steiner Hayward, and in the end, he did. And he walked away from his caucus, and so did the late Jackie Winters, who was suffering with some issues related to cancer at the time as well. And by a margin of a couple of votes, it passed. I've got one of those 4 or 5 signed copies of the legislation, right, when Governor Brown signed that. I might go down to Salem and disagree with Senator Steiner Hayward on the next 5 things she brings forward. But certainly good legislation is good legislation, and you cannot pass up those opportunities to do the right thing. I'm reminded again, Nolan, and I know we're getting a little bit short on time, but I probably brought forward the largest movement in the Columbia Basin, certainly that I'm aware of. And that is that, I said we cannot any longer put folks at risk relative to the nitrates that are getting into our aquifer. And I pushed back mightily a couple of years ago, and I went out and tested, 72 wells, right? And the lab called me on 70 of them and said, oh my God, these are immediate health hazard. So I declared a state of emergency, and the county are certainly attempted to. And the pushback I got was terrific, was tremendous. But I was unwavering. This was the right thing to do. And now even those folks, that pushed back are working like mad to get on the right side of history and lean into the effort. Because, folks' health, sadly, it broke down on ideology too, right? Those folks on the right side of the aisle, those tens of thousands of folks that were running the risk of, cancers and miscarriages and kidney cancer and thyroid and these challenges. And folks were looking at it through ideological eyes. And that is just not something I will do when I go to Salem. Like I say, I think you can preserve your values and the conservative values that you were born and raised with, and kind of conserve what it is to be from Eastern Oregon. But by God, if you look across the street and somebody's hurting, you go pick them up, right? And you don't go over and ask them, which side of the dang dial they're on. So when good legislation is presented, certainly that involves folks' health and well-being, it's pretty tough to think I will caucus and say, let us come fix our bridges before we, fix the health challenges that are going on, because those are just things that I won't, move on.
Awesome. Yep. I like that common theme of being able to, regardless of what side of their aisle they're on, is being able to pick up that person. Good legislation is good legislation regardless.
Yes.
The last thing I want to touch on, because I know you mentioned we are running out of time a little bit, but the Second Amendment. Eastern Oregon is big on firearms. A lot of people like to go out and shoot, and myself included. It's a lot of people hunt, a lot of people own firearms. So what are your thoughts on the Second Amendment and per se? Do you think that there's room to have some kind of regulation around from making it so certain people can't get firearms, making it so people have to have background checks, those sorts of things?
I'm pretty huge on the Second Amendment, right? I mean, the right to have and bear arms shall not be infringed. And the Oregon Constitution, frankly, even goes a little further. I would invite folks, I know we're pressed for time, but to go and look it up. It actually allows more protection than the Constitution of the United States does. But my son owns an outfitting business, right? We're avid hunters. Certainly probably have more firearms than I need. Having said that, Nolan, there's certainly folks out there that shouldn't have a firearm, right? There was a young man that I went to college with and lives in the same town that I'm in. And I lived with him in college, and he was a fantastic kid. Little known to me, he started slowly getting some mental health challenges, right? And he called me up one day, and he was an avid hunter, fisher, packed a sidearm occasionally. And he called me up, and he was having some episodes, and I didn't recognize him or what he was saying, right? And ultimately, I asked, law enforcement, who I certainly support, to go do a wellness check. That they did, and things, did a few more of them as they moved down the road, and it kind of culminated in a standoff between my dear friend, who I love dearly, and law enforcement. And they finally were able to get him into a mental health facility and kind of get him some things that he needed, right? And so, I shouldn't jest, but if you don't think folks need a background check, y'all haven't met my uncle. I say that in jest, but there's folks. So I think those things make sense a little bit, right? But just to have and bear arms, and I'm a huge supporter ultimately, and happy to hear that you and I from both sides of the aisle are, enjoy the shooting sports or hunting.
Certainly. Well, I appreciate your answer, Jim. I love the thing, the theme, people are people, and I appreciate you joining us. I'll say good luck on the campaign trail. If there is a way for people to find you on social media or your website, if you'd like to share that. There's a little bit of time
absolutely. They can go to JimDohertyForOregon.com and lead them to my webpage. Certainly go to the Facebook, which is, Jim Doherty for State Senate. Or they can certainly, find my webpage, and my phone number's on there, and my email is on there. My email is info@JimDohertyForOregon.com. And the one thing I love to do, Nolan, is go sit down and talk to anybody and everybody, and, not just talk to them, and not just, listen to them, but absolutely hear them, because I want to be the conduit for the small businesses and the people from either side of the aisle out here. I want to be their conduit to Salem.
Perfect. Great. And then we'll have your website in the description if there's any viewers on YouTube or podcasts, anything like that. But thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Nolan Bylenga Podcast.
Thanks, Nolan.
Thank you.